Hey guys, I'm here with a video showing you how I made the leg piece that goes on the left leg for my Blood Moon Katarina cosplay. To start off, I want to give a big thanks to Cosplay Supplies / Worbla NA for sponsoring me the Worbla to make this cosplay happen. They were kind enough to give me a couple sheets of Worbla in order to craft all of the armor and prop pieces for my Blood Moon Katarina cosplay in exchange for a couple video tutorials and some final photos. I will have a link to their sites and of course the Worbla in the description box below. I should also mention that Blood Moon Katarina is from League of Legends. You're going to need a few different supplies and tools for this. So what you'll need is a sheet of 4mm EVA foam, a sheet of Worbla, a sheet of 2mm EVA foam, a Dremel and medium and fine grit sandpaper, a heat gun, various adhesives, whatever adhesive you prefer, however I recommend contact cement. Velcro, priming material, I use wood glue, and then primer for the paint. I used Rust-Oleum's Sandable and Filler Paint Primer and Rust-Oleum's White Matte Paint Primer. Then you'll need whatever paints you prefer. You can use anything like airbrush paints, acrylics, and spray paint, whatever you prefer to work with. I used acrylics and oil paints for this. Then you'll need some kind of sealant. I use clear glossy spray paint. And you'll need cutting tools. Any cutting tools you're comfortable with. I used a mix of box cutters and scissors. And I believe that covers everything. If there's anything I forgot, I will have a list of all the tools and supplies I used in the description box below. I also want to note that I do have templates and patterns available for all of the Blood Moon Katarina pieces on my store Envy and Etsy, and those will also be linked in the description below. And with that, let's get on to the crafting. I started off by creating a pattern using the duct tape method. The duct tape method is where you wrap the part of you that you're trying to create a pattern for in a layer of plastic wrap, then a layer of duct tape, then draw in the shapes you need and any other seam lines, and then cut it all out. I have an entirely different video on how I do this on my channel already. Once I have my pattern, I trace it onto 4mm EVA foam and then cut that all out. I use kitchen shears. I get so many questions about the scissors I use. I use these spring-loaded kitchen shears as well as a box cutter. Don't forget to label your pieces. There are some edges that you'll want to cut out holding your blade at an angle to make it easier to get the needed bends when gluing the pieces together later. I suggest referring to a reference photo for this, but you'll also be able to see more of this later in the video. If you don't cut it out at an angle, don't worry, you can always just add that bevel edge in later using a pair of scissors or a Dremel, which is what I ended up doing because I totally blanked on doing this when cutting it out. Next, you'll want to start assembling the pieces. I started with the middle front section, gluing the two halves together at the center at an angle. I use contact cement as my adhesive. Every brand is different, so be sure to follow the instructions on the packaging for your contact cement and work in a well-ventilated area. While waiting for the glue to get tacky on the front middle section, I applied glue to the back middle sections too and cut the center edges at an angle so that they would come to a bend when I did eventually glue them together. I did this for all 3 or 4 layers. I don't remember how many there are now, oh my god. But I did this for all the layers of the back center sections. Once the glue is tacky, assemble the pieces. To keep the seam on the outer side as smooth and evenly aligned as possible, I attach the pieces while they're laying flat against a table. After that, I'll press the inner side together to get the bend. Sometimes the seam along the outer side will start to pop open since the glue hasn't fully dried at this point, so be sure to check and press this closed again if needed. I find that placing a layer of painter's tape over the seam before bending and pressing the seam together and completely closed helps keep the seam's edge on the outer side closed. Hopefully you understand what I'm talking about, as you can see it happening to me here. Repeat this step for all of the center pieces that we have already applied contact cement to. Katarina's armor is beveled along the edges, so next I added bevels to any of the edges that I wouldn't be able to reach once the leg piece was assembled. I did this using a Dremel. You'll want to look at a reference photo to get a better idea of what I'm talking about, but basically all of the edges for all of the pieces for this leg armor piece needs to have a beveled edge. I also smoothed out the seam lines of the pieces that I had just glued together. Next, I started layering the pieces. Again, I use contact cement for this. I started by attaching the top layer, which are these two small rectangle pieces, to the front centerpiece. Then I glued the back centerpieces together, stacking one on top of another using my template and reference photos as a guide for the placement. In between attaching some of these layers, I'd switch back over to my Dremel and bevel the edges as needed. You'll want to be sure to sand and bevel any edges that you won't be able to reach once the leg piece is assembled, and that you do this before gluing them into place. For example, when it came to the back center pieces of this leg armor piece, I would sand the edges along the sides after I glued down each layer. Here I went to glue the last layers of the back piece together. In order to be able to take this armor on and off but keep it fitted to my leg, I'll be keeping this back half of the armor completely separate from the front half. Like, I won't be gluing the two together at all. They're going to attach via Velcro instead, but you'll see more of this later. So basically, once I've glued on this last layer of this piece, I set this aside because it's pretty much done, at least for now. All I need to do is glue the front half together and then do a bit more sanding to smooth out some of the edges. But again, getting ahead of myself, we'll get through that in just a little bit. Moving on to the front half, I needed to attach the side pieces to the center piece, but I also had to leave a bit of a gap between the two pieces, so I couldn't glue them directly to one another. Instead, I took a large scrap of 2mm EVA foam and glued it along the edges of the centerpiece where the side pieces would attach, leaving a bunch of excess coming off of that centerpiece. Then I glued the side pieces into place and onto that same 2mm EVA foam sheet right next to the centerpieces, leaving a slight gap between the two. Cut away any excess 2mm EVA foam that is left over and hanging off the edges after that. Next, it was time for the Worbla. To start off, I took the pieces I had just glued together and pressed them as flat as possible onto a sheet of Worbla and then traced around it. Worbla is super flexible and can be stretched a bit when heated, so don't worry about getting it perfect, it just has to be close enough. I also added some excess Worbla around all of the edges so that I would be able to fold it over and better secure it around the foam once I started heating it and applying it to this foam piece. It's kind of like adding seam allowance. I forgot to mention, but earlier when gluing everything together, I had also glued all of the foot piece of the armor together. Well, most of it. I glued the center portion of the foot piece together at the center seam and then left the side portions of the foot piece separate and left the entire foot pieces separate from the rest of the armor, as you can tell here. This all will get attached later after the Worbla has been applied, but for now those are separate and I'm tracing them out onto Worbla as well, again adding some seam allowance around the edges. Once you've traced all of the pieces onto Worbla, cut it all out. I used heavy-duty scissors for this. Be sure to save all of your scrap pieces because they can be used at a later date in the future for future projects, since you can mold it all together and mold a piece you need like a tooth or a spike, or even flatten it all back out to make another kind of makeshift sheet of Worbla. You may want to cut out darts from the seam allowance at each corner to keep the Worbla from overlapping too much and adding extra bulk. After everything is cut out, it's time to wrap all of the foam pieces in Worbla. Heat up the Worbla with a heat gun until it becomes soft and malleable. For smaller pieces, you'll be able to heat it all up in one go without any real issues. For larger pieces, you're going to need to do something different, but for now I'll talk about the smaller piece that I'm working on here. So as I just said, you heat up the Worbla all in one go until it becomes soft and malleable, and once it is heated, place the Worbla onto the foam and wrap the excess Worbla, the seam allowance area, around the edges to secure it. Be sure to wear heat-safe gloves while doing this. It's okay to work slowly, by the way, no need to rush. If you find the Worbla is cooling down at any point, simply reheat it and it will be soft and flexible again, and you can continue to fold over those edges. For larger pieces, you'll need to work in sections. Heat up a section of Worbla and then place it onto the foam, wrapping any excess around the edges. Then heat up the next area and continue to press and smooth it onto the foam. Repeat this step over and over until you've reached the other end of the piece and everything is completely covered in Worbla. Be sure to press the Worbla into and around any and all details such as grooves or layers so that they don't get lost in this process or covered and disappear in the Worbla. You can use your fingers while wearing heat-safe gloves or plastic clay sculpting tools to help do this. Foam can't take as much heat as Worbla can, so while heating the Worbla up in sections, be sure not to heat it up so much that you start to overheat it and heat through it too much onto the foam, because you risk melting the foam underneath. A way to avoid this is to try to direct the airflow away from the foam whenever possible and work in quick motions to keep the airflow moving and not just focused in one spot, because that's how you tend to heat through the Worbla onto the foam base. Basically, you just kind of want to pay attention to how hot the Worbla is and how hot the foam is getting, and stop heating the Worbla as soon as it's flexible to avoid overheating the foam underneath. Once the pieces are covered in Worbla, you're going to want to heat up the entire piece one last time and shape it around your leg. Switch between heating up both the back and front of the armor piece, because both the foam and Worbla will need to be heated in order to keep its shape. Just take care, again, not to melt the foam, since the Worbla does need more heat to become soft and malleable than the foam does. Also be sure to wear long pants made from thicker fabric for this part, because you don't want to burn yourself or cover your leg in cloth. You may need to reheat and reshape some areas as they cool to get everything looking right and snugly fitted around your leg. After all of the pieces are shaped correctly, it's time to assemble them. I start by attaching the center foot piece to the bottom of the front leg piece following a reference photo and the labeling on my templates. Then I attach them just by heating up the Worbla in the areas that they will connect to one another and pressing them into place. The Worbla will act as an adhesive. I use a clay sculpting tool to better blend the seam at the front together to add some extra security. By the way, I wanted to note, when shaping this foot piece, I shaped it around my foot when I was standing normally, since that is how it will sit most of the time when I'm wearing it. Worbla armor isn't flexible once cooled, so just keep that in mind. If you want this section to stay flexible, leaving it as just foam and sealing it with Plasti Dip might be a better option. I didn't get a chance to record this, but I used scrap pieces of Worbla to create the teeth at the top of the leg armor. To do this, I heated up the scrap pieces and rolled them into a ball until smooth and blended, reheating as needed. Then I molded them into teeth shapes and then attached them to the top of the armor, heating the areas that would connect to one another and letting the Worbla act as an adhesive. I used clay sculpting tools to blend out the seams a bit. Attach the side foot pieces to the front of the leg armor as well, following the template labeling and the reference photos. This piece should be stuck under the foot and leg pieces, and it should be the bottom layer technically. After everything is covered in Worbla and the front half of the leg armor is fully assembled, the back should have only been the 3-layered piece showed earlier. It's time to start prepping for painting. Worbla has a rough texture, so the first thing you're going to have to do is a lot of sanding. This is going to take a while and can be tiring. Sand the armor until it's pretty smooth. It doesn't have to be perfect, as the next few steps will help smooth it further. And the next few steps is what you're seeing here. I went ahead and skipped filming the sanding part. You can see that in some of the other videos in this series, but it's pretty boring to watch and it's nothing special. It's just running a piece of sandpaper back and forth. I used a medium grit sandpaper for it, by the way. Anyways, moving on, after everything is sanded as smooth as it can pretty much get, or as smooth as you want it to get, again, it doesn't have to be perfect, it's time to apply some wood glue. Coat all of the pieces in a layer of wood glue, let that dry, sand it with medium grit sandpaper, and then repeat all of those steps over and over until you're happy with how smooth it is. I did about 3 to 5 layers. I think it was 5, although for some of the smaller pieces, not in this armor though, like for some of the other armor pieces in this series, I did about 3. So it really just depends on when you're happy with it. I finished sanding the last layer using a fine grit sandpaper. After the layers of wood glue, I coated the piece with a sandable spray paint primer and filler from Rust-Oleum. I do 2 layers of this, sanding with a medium grit sandpaper after the first layer dried, and a fine grit sandpaper after the second. If you find there's any gaps or dents in the armor, or it just isn't quite as smooth as you would like it to be, like there might be some really rough areas still, apply Bondo's glazing and spot putty after the wood glue step, but before this one. Apply as many layers as needed, sanding after each, and coat it all with one final layer of wood glue, sanding afterwards. The key to getting smooth Worbla armor is a lot of filling and sanding. And by filling, I mean products that are meant to fill rough textures like holes in walls or scratches in cars. After all of that, it's time for painting. I prepped the armor by giving it a coat of white spray paint primer. I decided to paint the gold part first, so I'm painting the teeth first because that's the only gold part on all of this leg piece. Since I was trying to use my airbrush to start with, I needed to section off the rest of the armor and used a mix of paper and painter's tape to do this. Keyword here was trying, by the way. I tried to use my airbrush, but something went wrong partway through, so I had to switch to using regular acrylic paint. Luckily, it's working fine now. I just wish it was working at the time of making this. Not that it would have been any easier or anything like that, or any better. Honestly, any paint will do. Anything like acrylic, airbrush, or spray paint should be just fine. So just pick whichever medium you're comfortable with. I got to do about 1 layer of gold with my airbrush before it kind of just gave out. So after that, I did a couple more layers with gold acrylic paint instead to get it fully opaque. Then once I was happy with it, I removed the painter's tape and paper and continued on to paint the rest of the armor. If you're just using acrylics, you probably won't need to section anything off, so I didn't bother sectioning off the gold teeth for this next step. However, if you struggle with keeping a steady hand, painter's tape may still be a good idea in order to avoid getting any red on the teeth. So, as I just said, the next step was to paint the rest of the leg piece, both the front and the back, red entirely. Again, the teeth are the only different colored section on this whole piece of armor. It took a couple layers of red paint before it was fully opaque, but once I was happy with it, I coated everything with a coat of clear, glossy spray paint in order to seal it and prep it for the next step. Next, it was time to shade the armor. I did this using oil paint. I brushed on black oil paint in any areas that I felt needed to have some extra depth or shadows added to them, such as around the edges, in battle damage, and around any details or layers. Use a fluffy brush and or a cloth to blend out the paint and soften it up a bit so that it looks more like shadows. You can also use your fingers, although that's a bit more messy. Once you're happy with the paint, let it dry and then seal it with one final layer of a clear glossy spray paint. Usually oil paint takes like a day or two to dry, so just keep that in mind while working on your cosplay. However, I have definitely sealed it before it was fully dry and everything turned out fine. I also decided to add small highlights around any raised edges, or most of them at least, such as around the battle damages and around the edges of upper or top layers. I used a thin detail brush and white acrylic paint to paint on these details, except around the larger edges or longer edges. For that, I watered down acrylic paint a bit and then tried to lightly apply it and blend it as I was going along using a fluffy brush and damp rag. Basically, I wanted anything that went along longer edges to look a bit more subtle. I should also note that I also applied it down any center or sharp bends, such as the center of this leg armor where it's bent. I applied a watered down line of white acrylic paint just to make it pop a bit more. White oil paint probably would have been a better option here. I just didn't have any, so this is how I did it. If you choose to do this, be sure to seal it once you're happy with it with what will now be your new final layer of clear glossy spray paint. Once the painting is done, it's time for the final step, which is to add Velcro to the pieces so that you can connect them to one another. Add a strip at either side on the inside of the front half of the leg armor and a strip to either side on the outside sides of the back half of the leg armor. You'll see how this looks shortly. And that finishes up the leg pieces. This is how they look at the end. You should have two separate leg pieces that can attach via Velcro at the sides. And yeah, hopefully you guys found this video easy to follow along with, enjoyed this video, found it helpful. Thanks again to Cosplay Supplies for supplying me with the Worbla to create this cosplay, and thanks so much to you guys for watching. If you want to see the final photos of the entire cosplays, I will be posting those over to my Instagram and website. Both of those are linked down below. Again, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Have a lovely day. Thanks for watching, and bye!